Take it away, Robbie and Elijah.
Good morning, folks. So Elijah and I are going to talk you through sort of the benefits and pitfalls of what was actually an existing system and how we brought Drupal into it. So this is going to be very much a conversation type session. And I think the one thing I'll warn ahead of time is there's a lot of words on the slides, but we wanted to make sure we gave some context for afterwards so we can actually give you something to take away once you have the slide deck, because there's a lot of details that are important and we're probably not going to hit on all of them. So just an example of why the slides have so many words. But I'm Robbie Holmes, and
I'm Elijah Lynn.
I was the technical product owner for the actual CMS project when it was going on for VA.gov, and I was a member of the USDS, the United States Digital Service.
And I was one of the implementers at Agile 6 applications. I am still, yeah.
Nice, move on. Let's go to the next one. I think we can leave this up for just a second, so that way it's in the video, and this is the session that you're sitting in.
Okay, that's good. All right.
Cool. So let me start with how we got where we were going. So it started off back in the day, the United States Digital Service stood up a team at the Department of Veterans Affairs, and that team went and looked for something to work on to assist the veterans, and then realized that what they were going to build was vets.gov. So they created a single unified experience for veterans to track, manage, and apply the benefits that they had earned. So there's a lot of detail here. I think the big starting point was the site was built in Jekyll. So there was a static site built as the original vets.gov when it stood up for Veterans Day of 2015. I joined the team in 2016, in March of 2016. At that point, we were starting to bring in React apps as the way that interactions were going to be done, and Rails was being used to build out the APIs behind that. During this time period, there was a refactoring of Metalsmith, of our Jekyll site into Metalsmith for lots of reasons, but the biggest one was that it was going to remove Ruby from our build process for the website. So it was sort of simplifying and streamlining the build process because we needed Webpack and Node as part of the process. So that way we moved over to Metalsmith, which was basically a Jekyll port into Node at the time. So when we started, there was a lot of build scripts that were only just basically bash scripts, and it was running in Travis CI to do the deploys. Over time, that migrated into Jenkins, and then as we moved over from there, Jenkins was able to sort of actually continue and do the automation and orchestration of deployment. So next slide. The next part here is where things got really interesting. So in 2018, the Department of Veterans Affairs decided that the work that was being done on vets.gov was proving that modern website technologies and modern solutions, user experience, HCD could all actually be done in the agency. So they decided to move all of that work into VA.gov. So it went from being a place where veterans could track, manage, and apply the benefits they had earned to basically taking all of that experience and moving it into the main front door of VA.gov and how veterans interacted with the VA. So just to give some technical component here, like vets.gov at its high point, I think was about 8% of all traffic at the Department of Veterans Affairs, and VA.gov was like 58% of all traffic. So by taking all this work and migrating it into VA.gov, we were able to sort of almost like close to 7 or 8x the effectiveness of all the work that we had completed up to that point. But that also changed a little bit the mandate. So instead of it just being track, manage, and apply the benefits you earned, it was also come to this place and find out information. So for a long time, we talked about whether or not we were going to need a CMS on vets.gov, and this was when it actually became the process. So on vets.gov, the way that content was handled was basically writing out markdown files and rendering them through the static build process. So there was a content repository in GitHub that actually had its own external workflow for how things were approved. And the decision was made at that time to go and get a CMS. So in government, getting a CMS involves procurement. So at that point, the USDS team on the ground at the VA partnered with the Technology Acquisition Center within the Department of Veterans Affairs, and we helped write and create a procurement opportunity that would bring in a company to implement a CMS as part of this process. What was really interesting was it was a very modern approach on procurement. It was actually done in each vendor came in and did an on-site creation of a solution based on a real world problem. And that had to be done within like a 4 to 6 hour window. So literally people went to New Jersey and sat in a room and built a thing to prove they could do it. It was much more show, don't tell, which is a really exciting aspect of how we were able to procure a team to do this work.
So it was kind of like a hackathon then, right?
Yeah, it was definitely, they were handed a piece of paper that said, this is what you need to build. Here is a person who's going to act as though they're a business owner inside of the government. And then they could ask questions of that person. But at the end of about 6 hours, they had to do a demo of how they built it, the process by which they went through it, and show working code at the end of it, which is a little bit different than the way a lot of procurements are done.
Yeah, I was going to say, because like that's not a normal thing, right?
I mean, it's getting to be a little bit more, it's happening more frequently, but I don't think it's the way that standard procurements are done in government. A lot of times it's writing up 30 pages of past performance and then writing a solution as opposed to showing people how you would do it.
Nice.
Pretty exciting in general. So that contract was awarded, and then the project started in October of 2018. So just before Veterans Day, just as a note. Seems like that always is an important date in the Department of Veterans Affairs, for good or for ill. Go ahead, Elijah. So the next one here is then the project kicked off, and over the next 6 months, work was done, and eventually the CMS itself launched as part of the build process. What was interesting is it was very much an MVP, right? So the things that landed by that March were the first product, which was the veterans, the VA medical centers. So they launched the Pittsburgh VA Medical Center as the prototype to prove that out. A lot of migration went into place, taking all of that content from the GitHub repository that was markdown files and migrating it into Drupal. And then at that point, we couldn't change the build process, but we had to refactor it because the structure of the data that was coming out of Drupal, the decision was made to use GraphQL. So it was a lot of queries that were returning JSON objects, which were very different than the structure of the markdown that was in the original content files. And then that leads to sort of where things are today. So Elijah, if you'd like to take that over, that would be great.
Sure. And just to add on, the GitHub content repository that was the content store was an open source repo. It still is to this day. And so is the front end build scripting and templating system in React and all that stuff. So I think I'll cover that again. I just wanted to highlight that's pretty interesting that the content itself was in an open state already. The current state, we hit some performance limitations on. We had like this big, large GraphQL request. We ultimately kind of built up, made of GraphQL fragments, and I think we're at like 3 to 4 minutes, and we're at 1,000 nodes, but a bunch of nested entities, entity references, and we're migrating. To give you an idea, we're migrating from GraphQL to Drupal Tome Sync, which is basically a bunch of static JSON files. The same content that we're shipping now. Basically, we're at like 20,000 static JSON files, and that's so it's like 20,000 basically entity files. That make up this export. So there's some complications around doing that, but it's way faster. Like we have a technique to tar the data up on the server, and it keeps it up to date, Drupal Tome Sync, and it caches, it invalidates the cache and everything, so it always updates the content real time. But that request is like under a half second to get the 20,000 files, and it's in a tar file. They just zip it down, tar it up and send it off to the Jenkins server, and then Jenkins server can churn through that data store really quickly. So we're
one cool side effect that I think Elijah is leaning in here is by tarring it, you're making it a single file. and AWS and all of the traffic being sent within the Amazon infrastructure will speed up over time on a larger file. So if we sent individual files, you would have had to do an HTTP request for each file, but just by wrapping it up into a single tar file and not zipping or compressing it, we actually were able to take advantage of speeding up of the actual data transmission from one place to another. And that actually turned out to be significantly faster than compressing it and then pushing it and then uncompressing it and and untarring it. So it was a lot of testing and playing around that got us to the point where this was the solution we ended up with.
Yeah, internally, you if you're not in the same placement zone as an AWS, little technical note that you get 3 gigabit per second network speed, and you can bump it up to 10 gigabit per second. And yeah, the CPU from not zipping, not compressing it takes way longer to do that. It takes like 10, 15 seconds to compress those 20,000 files. So yeah.
So the next one was sort of the VAMCs, right? And our friend Kevin Walsh is on the call right now, who did a lot of work having to do with this product specifically. And that there's more and more work being done of trying to bring across the work that was done for the first VAMC into all the VAMCs. So allowing this to become an actual product inside of the VA of how a VA medical center is now represented for the Department of Veterans Affairs. And it's a huge impact because this is, people don't realize it, but the Department of Veterans Affairs is basically 3 cabinet level agencies in one. And the Department of Veterans Affairs has the VHA, which is the Veterans Health Administration, which is, yeah, it is, James. It is, but the VHA is really the largest medical institution and network inside of the US. And it's unbelievable when you start to think about things from that perspective. So this is in and of itself going to have a huge effect on how veterans interact with their health inside of the VA.
Yeah, and we have, the Department of Veterans Affairs. We're linking to it in the appendix, so there will be a link to it. But we have a Drupal page for the Department of Veterans Affairs. We've got a bunch of contributions. We got 4 new modules contributed. We have got 2 more on the way. Ton of contributions. The leadership at the VA, whenever we mention that we've open sourced something, they love it. Their smiles on their face just light right up.
Yeah,
so,
it's also a situation of ask for forgiveness and not permission. I created the organization in Drupal.org while I was working as part of USDS, and then told them I did it. So it went really well. So it's just something you should think about when you're bureaucracy hacking. I think we should move on, Elijah.
I did not know that. Thank you, Robbie.
So this is our problem statements. So in general here, what we were trying to accomplish or what we thought we were going to get benefits out of by moving to this system. So this is just sort of a listing of all the things that we're about to go over. So you can move to the next one. Sorry, go back one. The things we needed to take care of, right? We needed to get rid of the GitHub repository. We needed to replace an existing CMS that was actually serving up a large portion of the traffic. There was a team site instance that is still serving up some traffic today, but the decision was made that it was not able to sort of meet the needs of the modern authoring experience. The contract requirement when we wrote it was that the new CMS had to be open source. There's lots of reasons for that, but one of them is that there is a federal open source policy where 20% of all code that is created inside of an agency is supposed to be open sourced. It was created during the Obama administration, and I believe at some point someone is going to bring back that federal open source policy, and having us done the work that we're doing today will allow the CIO at the Department of Veterans Affairs to have a leg up before they even get to that point. The next 2 are really, the next 3 are really important aspects of what was logistically a problem. I think when it came down to it, VA.gov needed to remain up during the entire lifecycle, the lifecycle of developing Drupal as a product. And then beyond that, the existing editorial workflows, both the content repo and the use of team site had to continue working while we were bringing Drupal up. And then the last one was that the build process had to just sort of be plugged into by Drupal. So we were not serving or rendering pages through Drupal. It was literally just using Drupal as a content repository and as a way to get data into this content build process to generate static files. So we couldn't rebuild it from scratch. We were asked to keep it in place and to move forward. Yeah,
the goal was just to swap out the GitHub open source content repository with the CMS as functionality.
So the next slide is our assumptions. These are the things we were hopeful that we were going to get out of this process. We'll find on future slides that there were some benefits and also some pitfalls, hence the title of this talk. So I think we can move over and we can talk about each one of these.
Yeah, there'll be 4 slides corresponding to each one of these.
Okay, Elijah, all yours.
Right, assumption, a fully rendered static file website that is hosted on AWS S3, so it'll be secure, fast, and reliable. A lot of benefits here. Initially, when I came on this project, I was didn't really understand why we were doing a static file website. And over time, as one of the DevOps engineers and maintaining infrastructure around it became kind of nice. You know, I didn't have to worry about DDoS attacks or configuring a CDN to shield those off. Didn't have to worry about setting up varnish. Really, all of our traffic on the CMS is authenticated, so it's mostly editors and administrative users. There's no actually front end templating served from Drupal, so I didn't have to set up varnish. There's no point in setting up varnish for this or a CDN. Like, that was all handled by the other team. Security updates to the front end are handled as part of the build process, not on a running system. So when we do get security updates for Drupal, we do apply them, but we don't, it's not, the urgency is not quite as there. We're behind a firewall. Somebody has to be within the system to even attack Drupal in this case. So security updates are handled by a different team. Performance, I mean, it's static files. This is the good old days. I built my first website in '99, and these were, I think it was like, if your index.html file was like over 20 kilobytes, or I was like, that was slow. And so we're just getting straight HTML out of S3. S3 is the web server. And because of the way the static site kind of build process works, we literally have a snapshot for every single deployment. All the index.html files, the images, everything is just right there.
So I think I would push in there, right? So then everything is in flat files. So that means the deployment went from pushing probably about 1,000 files when it was vets.gov to when we were rendering all the pages that were coming out of Drupal and all of the CMS and all of the JS and all the image files, right? Our deployment process continued to grow like exponentially because of the amount of files. So, and initially when we were doing the deploys, we were using the S3 CLI to do those deploys. And by default, each one of those files had to be put using the API. So that meant standing up and connecting and doing an HTTP request for 8,000 files near the end of the time where we realized this was getting messy.
Yeah,
so
they're one at a time individually.
So it's not that there was a lot of data, but in the end, it was that there were many files. So it was many small HTTP requests that were causing us to slow down. So when we were building in the past, right, it was less than 1,000 files. So it was expected. It was like, I think 3 to 4 minutes to do a deploy of that item. In the case of, by the time we were actually rendering individual files from Drupal as part of the build process, and we had migrated all that content, it was the combination of every image that had been, that we were actually pulling from Drupal, every single asset, all the PDFs, all the videos, all that kind of stuff had to be deployed as part of every deployment process. That's why it continued to grow. So every time we published new content, the deployment process took longer.
Yeah, and eventually the whole thing eventually took like 25 minutes or so to deploy based on the S3 limitation of the API. And
that led to the first pitfall, which was we couldn't actually do any instantaneous deploys. If there was an issue that was affecting a VAMC, right, say a medical center was lost power, we couldn't update the website immediately to say that center was closed or that there was an alert that had to go out on the homepage. So things like that ended up becoming part of a standard process. So that deployment process took about 25 minutes, but it also required us to run all of the automated tests also. So that was like link checking. And so that entire build process took about an hour when it came down to it with everything involved. And that was way too long for us to be able to do that every single time that there was an emergency announcement that had to go out. And I think the last one is the security, right? We did do security updates on the CMS, but now we had 2 distinct security processes that had to be run for one website. right? So it was a combination of like making sure that all of the front end stuff was up to date and also making sure that Drupal was secure. It's sort of, it wasn't that bad, but it did create a secondary amount of security updates that were handled by two distinct teams. So two separate reviews, two separate on every single security update. Cool. Next slide.
Yeah. And it was, as part of like the story here, we are in our current state, I think we're at like 6-minute build and deploy times, and the reason we're using TomeSync now is to get that down to 3 minutes. Then there's only like a couple seconds on the Drupal side, and the rest of it's on the build. And then it creates a GitHub release, and then it deploys it. And the deployment's gotten faster. They used a different library, different parallelized S3 put now. So it is getting faster, but we're still not anywhere near what we're all used to with Drupal as like instant publishing. So we're working towards, it's like a whole bunch of effort has gone into making like getting close to near real-time publishing. So yeah. All right. This is the next slide.
Yep. You want to kick it off, Elijah?
Sure. Another assumption was that Drupal is only the authoring experience and not rendering or serving like live traffic to veterans would be less complicated because Drupal is just that. Some of the benefits, were that we were able to have a highly customized authoring experience, much better than the GitHub workflow. That just wasn't scalable to people that didn't know how to use GitHub. So we are doing a lot of workflow improvements now based on Drupal has tremendous permission and role functionality. So, imagine that that's happening. Drupal's menu system has improved editing and consistency of the static menu system. That's something you can use in the UI now, right? Like before, you'd have to do that in code mostly. Redirect system is simplified, how created and managed. One of the pitfalls of that last one, though, and I'll just jump from the bottom, is that we don't have that nice redirect. Like on the front end build process, we actually are still creating some 404s in certain cases when we rename a piece of content and the URL changes. That's not quite handled yet, so we're working through that. It's solvable. Back to the first pitfall. Go ahead, Robbie.
Yeah, so there are three problems that are created because of this. Like the reality is there are 3 different types of redirects that exist on VA.gov today. One is actually handled by we don't have and own every single subdomain. And that means that they actually have to inject some JavaScript into the header of pages that are not owned and routed through VA.gov. So if it was like Robbie.va.gov, you would have to have a JavaScript injection that would contain a redirect if that page no longer existed. So that is one problem. Another was that they were doing some inside of the content itself. So sometimes when they wanted to move a piece of content from one place to another in the old build process, they would actually do a JavaScript update of a window directly in the content file. And then the third was that they were handling things sort of at the proxy layer. So they were doing redirects while they were generating and instantiating new proxies. They would have a list of redirects that would be generated at that point. So the hope was we were going to be able to do that for all at the proxy layer. But in the end, we just sort of continued to move forward how complicated the redirects were. Eventually, I think they will get there when they get control of all of the traffic that is considered VA.gov and all of the subdomains. But I think right now it's just shining a spotlight on how complicated that is.
Yeah, and we currently have a proposal that we're working through to actually do a dual redirect system. Robbie, you might know those, but using S3 has native redirect functionality in S3. So you can actually do real redirects with the S3 server. But then if you're developing locally, you can't actually tell that it's working. So to just do a fallback meta refresh or meta redirect, I forget what the tag is, in HTML, so it actually works on the local developers' machines as well.
I think the biggest pitfall that we ran into in this entire process was that there's no native preview. right? So when you take
yeah.
Drupal out of the mix and you are not rendering a theme in Drupal that is going to be utilized for rendering the site, then you have no native way to actually do quick previews of the content that you want to do. And that created all kinds of chaos. In the end, the build team, the team that was responsible for the actual deployment and building of the static files, created a secondary preview script that would render the page, a single page at a time. And that ended up creating drift between the two, the build process and the preview process. So there's lots and lots of things that became difficult through this. So just something to keep in mind. And wouldn't say that it's solved. I think there are lots of ways to tackle this problem that have not yet been exercised, but this is something that you will lose inherently if you are not at least creating a theme that matches exactly what your build process is going to be doing. So that created a lot of chaos for us. And the last one was, and we'll touch a little bit more on this in the future, it was pretty difficult to validate internal and external links in general, because this page may be published, but another page may not be. So if you are publishing multiple pages in one flow, that means you will probably get a broken link on a page that is not yet published that will be published as part of this. So the idea of being able to publish in bulk would be helpful, but it is also just something that gets a little more complicated when you actually pull Drupal out into this type of static and build environment.
Yeah. Do you want to cover number 3 a little bit?
Yeah, so the mega menu was originally created through a gigantic JSON file that was handled manually by the developers in the build process repo. In the end, the decision was made to start using Drupal for this data, and it was really used for that data. It was literally turned into a GraphQL request that was then parsed and processed into what was eventually going to become known as the mega menu. So this is cool, but complicated, right? It is not just rendering Drupal's menu. This is having to build and parse code, parse JSON data to render a menu, as opposed to just letting Drupal's menu system render it for you. That meant that there was, again, redirect issues, there were unpublished link issues. So things like that got a little more complicated than I think we would normally expect. So it's possible, just not simple. So I think this one is fun because content as CMS as only a content repo meant there would be no veteran-facing theming or UX work. That is true. The content in and of itself became a product. The CMS was a product. I don't know that everybody thought about it that way when we started, but in the end, it is true. But it had to plug into the build system seamlessly-ish. And then the authoring experience was decoupled from the output. So there were lots and lots of entities that existed inside of Drupal that were not directly correlated to pages. So that also, it was both good because it could be used in multiple places, but it was a secondary pitfall because the authors didn't know what it was going to look like. So again, preview became part of that problem. I think the big one here is the things that we found is that because the Drupal content is extremely tightly coupled to the build process, that people actually had to know exactly what that content looked like. The content model had to directly match what the build process was expecting. I think the other one here, and I this is one that I hit on a lot, Conway's Law is that is a complete and utter derivative of the fact that your organization will eventually match the design of your product, will match the structure of your organization. So in this case, our products and our contracts inside of the VA actually aligned to these hard edges of the problems that we were trying to solve. Because of that, the next thing became very obvious. So if you were running a build process and you were trying to figure out what was going wrong, Drupal and the content system became the scapegoat, or was blamed for a lot of the issues, because that's where the content editor saw the problem. But the reality was it was a very highly decoupled and static site built system. It was really hard to pinpoint where the problem actually existed. So in the end, it made it confusing and convoluted to understand where the problem was. Not that it was a problem in general, but just where to start. So triaging a problem in the build process was very difficult because there were multiple teams that were responsible for different aspects of that.
Yeah, this was still is a really challenging issue to deal with. In this kind of structured contract government way. We routinely have to triage issues and because it's the CMS and it does seem to be like, oh, start here. And but it could not be our issue at all. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, but it's definitely a thorny thing.
And I think one thing you know all of us have experienced is once you become the replacement or the touch point for where an end user talks to a system, if a failure happens, you are basically going to absorb the responsibility for that failure, whether it's yours or someone else's. Mm-hmm. I said this a lot when we were working on vets.gov. As we started bringing some of the functionality from internal systems inside the VA to the veteran in ways they had not been able to experience it before. If the subsystem behind it went down, we were going to get the blame. And I think Drupal ended up becoming sort of the front door for the content editorial workflow. So if something broke for the content editors, then it was obviously Drupal's fault. And I think that is not always the case. Preview being the perfect example, right? Preview was not owned by the CMS team. Preview was owned by the build team. So if there was a preview problem, it was very difficult to understand where or how to triage that problem. So again, not something that was impossible to overcome, but it was something that you should think of as you're going into a project like this, that you should keep in mind will be more complicated because of this.
Yeah, another note is a little bit from before too, is that the preview, it's because they're like different servers. We didn't have them in our CI environments. You couldn't spin up a new preview server for everything. So we ultimately ended up doing full site builds for previewing in CI and locally. So that was really useful, but also the preview functionally works differently, and it's full site preview, which we should have in production anyways. But so there's issues around that for sure still. One of the things that I think, like if you're doing this, one of the things the VA is exploring is restructuring things into product teams. I don't know how that's working with contracts, but I think that might help solve it so that it's one entire product. So they're thinking more holistically about this now, and it'll just be one larger product team that all works together. So this might actually solve some of this stuff. I'm hopeful.
Okay, let's move to the next one because we're a little bit over, I think.
Yep.
Last one, the other experience in the website build process were discrete, and it meant that there were two separate teams who owned them, and they could scale and they could run independently. The reality is that's kind of true. The front end team didn't actually, and the build process team didn't need to know Drupal. That is a truth. The next one was the CMS team did not have to understand the templating and the build process. That is kind of a fib. In the end, the content team and the CMS team ended up having to learn a lot more about the build process than I think they ever expected. Both teams were able to move independently and scale easier. Sort of true. The discrete ownership meant that they could both deploy independently. Well, this became a pitfall in and of itself. The reality was the front end team and the build process team needed to understand the data model. So every time that anything changed in Drupal's data model, they had to make subsequent changes in the build process for parsing and rendering pages. The next one being that there are two separate repos, one for the CMS and one for the front end build process. So they had, and they had different deployment cadences. The Drupal CMS was deploying like once a week at one point, and there were daily deploys on the front end and the build process itself for VA.gov. That ended up creating all kinds of chaos. We ended up bringing in feature flags for a while, which meant that every time there was feature flags, there would be a build failure at least once per feature flag, because you would either have it flagged properly on one side and then you'd have to build from the CMS and the CMS wouldn't have been updated yet, or you would have the build process not flagged properly and the CMS would have changed its data model. So inherently, when we created this with two separate repositories, there was always a failure of a build at least once per feature flag. So we ended up having to troubleshoot and triage a lot of times and scramble the jets when we probably didn't need to. And then the last piece here is that the deployments ended up being in sync. They had to be in sync in order for us to be able to do this work. So over time, the CMS did move to a daily deployment process. So that way there was less and less need for feature flags. But the reality was this was sort of blowing up our hypothesis that the teams would be able to deploy independently. That is just another side effect, not something that was impossible to overcome, but it eventually became the simplest way to solve this problem.
Yeah, and I will note that we're doing daily deployments now with Drupal, and it is one of the best things ever. I don't think I'll ever go back to that. I'm so happy that US Digital Service kind of infused, like that was a top-down decision. That was not a bottom-up decision. It wasn't me managing up saying, can we do this? It was like, no, you need to do this. So I was really excited. I was been wanting to do that for a long time. So
just a side
really
note, the build process for VA.gov was the same one that we started with for vets.gov, which was every day at 2 o'clock, a pull request would be made into a release branch. And if no one touched it for an hour, it would automatically merge and cause a deployment to trigger. Yep. So we had set up a daily deployment inside of vets.gov, which carried over to VA.gov during the brand merger, which then eventually was forced upon the CMS team, which was a really nice side effect of us making that decision almost 4 years ago.
Yeah, and because of that, then I think Robbie said this, but I just want to highlight again that remove the need for the feature flagging stuff so much. Yeah.
Cool. I think that's sort of it for our benefits and pitfalls. And linked past this on the next 2 slides are the appendix to the links of all the things we cared about, and also to the actual other sessions of our friends who presented about VA.gov and the VA process from everybody who's working on anything related to VA.gov.
Yeah, and worth highlighting that number 3 here is another session coming up at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time today that you can get some more information. Kevin Walsh from Civic Actions will be doing that one. I forget who else, if Kevin, if you're on, who's doing that one as well. But
excuse me, Jane Newman will be there.
Jane Newman.
So if you want actual information for real about the VAMC projects, Kevin will contradict me and make everything right, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I put links on here. I want to highlight the 2 ones in the middle here. These are open source repos. You can fully stand up the entire www.va.gov website locally, including your CMS. You have to read the docs and sort through some stuff.
Read a lot of docs.
Yeah, there's a fully sanitized database dump too, so you can actually spin the whole thing up locally and actually use it. So it's quite a wonderful thing to see in government. Technically, you could even make a public issue if you found a bug on the website, something like that. Like this is where we're seeing our government headed. This is happening. So this is really exciting.
Cool. I want to make sure that we answer any of the questions that Neil hasn't secretly been answering for us behind the scenes. Also, thanks, Neil.
Anything you want to get in the recording, please ask out loud. I can't even see the chat right now. So.
Yeah. So I think the one that hasn't been talked about yet is how are redirects deployed from Drupal to the static site. So I wrote kind of a white paper on how this should be done to present to the teams internally. In the end, one of the modules that was created was a redirect module that allowed us to choose the type of redirect it was going to be, because in Drupal, there's not a need for this understanding of more than one type of redirect. Because like I described, there were 3 different types of redirects required. That meant that we could actually create in the GraphQL data, sort of segmented sections of JSON, one for this type, one for that type, one for the other type. So there are 3 distinct ways this would actually be parsed and processed. My hope in the end is that it will be that we can query the redirects out of Drupal, and then we can write a flat file into the Nginx proxy of all of the redirects. So it's handled long before it touches anything else at the VA. So the network topology of the way the VA works is any traffic that goes to the VA comes internally to the VA, hits a proxy server, which then routes it either to S3, which is why the time to first byte will always be as fast as the light can travel across the interwebs from anywhere you are to inside the VA to Amazon West for GovCloud, GovCloud, and then back to wherever you are. So literally, I think the fastest we ever were able to track it is, I think, 8 seconds to get something to time to first byte. But that is the way that the traffic is routed.
Maybe. Oh, I don't.
At one point, Albert Wong, who is an amazing USDSer, I think it might have been 4.2 seconds or something like that, was utilizing the speed of light as the fastest way we would be able to travel across and get something to the end user. But the reality here was it meant that you end up hitting a proxy server. You can hit a proxy server internally at the VA. So my hope was we would take all those redirects and we would write the flat file that is the redirects into the Nginx config at instance creation time when they're automatically spinning up a new Nginx proxy. So that is one way that I think that in the end we could get around this problem that we have today. But that means that we would have to take control of all of the DNS for all things that are the VA.gov domain. So all of the subdomains, the Robbie.va.gov, would also have to be routed in the same path. They are not today. They're handled separately.
Hey, we've got some other questions in there. If you want to read them out loud, Robbie, or I can, just let me know.
Yeah, if you want to, I just want to make sure I hit all of them. I don't know, because they're sort of interspersed right now. Do you have any that you can hit?
All the earlier ones were answered, as far as I could tell. If yours wasn't answered, can you paste it again? Meanwhile, John Poos, sorry, don't know how to pronounce your name. Pew, sorry about that. You were able to incorporate web testing into CMS. Can you speak to the challenges getting web team used to, the web team used to Drupal CI, or they essentially test, or do they still essentially test assuming Drupal may not be available? John, did you want to clarify that question, or did I read it okay?
No, I think that was fine. I think it was.
Oh, you're cutting in and out.
To try to incorporate the web build process so they could understand it and test it and ensure that it was stable. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, I think the essence of this is that the front end and build process team had never been exposed to how Drupal works, and then we utilized a project that allowed us to do Drupal CI directly. So we had separate instances. Elijah, what's the name of the awesome product that Pew works on all the time?
Open Dev Shop is what we're currently using for CI.
So it allowed us to stand up separate instances based on PRs, based on all kinds of criteria. And then the build team wasn't as familiar with any of the tooling having to do with Drupal. And that meant there was a little bit of a clash of technologies, but also mind share of why we should be testing the way we were. So the reality is either the build process could be broken based on something that was done in Drupal, or the Drupal build process, the Drupal content model could be wrong based on what was going on. So in the end, I think Open Dev Shop and the Dev Shop instances were running all of the build tests. So that way we could validate that we weren't going to break the build in the actual, once the content changed. So this was sort of a preemptive strike, a little defensive development to make sure that the build process was going to succeed after the changes were made in the CMS. But it took a long time for the other team to sort of understand the value and to sort of get to the point where they understood why. And there was all kinds of technology where I think Pew should eventually do a talk about DevShop and the VA.gov process, because it landed a lot of new features in DevShop, and it also made him think about things a little bit differently.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I guess the final thing was just that are they still testing against like the dev site for CMS and consuming that content, or for their PRs? I mean, in the web PRs.
I'm not sure, Elijah, have they changed the build process? So in the past, they would utilize what was considered dev as their sort of source of truth for running the build process, for running the tests in their development process. And what Pew is leaning in on is the fact that if we utilized DevShop and we could spin up an instance, we could actually use different instances. So we could test against a specific version of the build process. We could test against a specific version of Drupal. So there's a lot of things that it allowed for a lot more matrixed set of testing. I don't think that the build team is actually pivoted over to using Drupal CI as the way that they do things. So I think they're still probably pointed to dev would be my guess.
We've got,
all the PRs and things like that are now pointing to prod, actually.
Cool.
That's great. Yeah. I think that was kind of one of the big things. Is like they were treating dev like canonical, but dev is dev. It breaks all, like it could break any time, right? So that's awesome to hear they're using the main content source.
Cool.
Hey, we've got
lots of friends answering questions for us. This is great. Go for it, Tim. Anything else we haven't touched on, Tim?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was muted. Ralph Noller says, is there a module plugin necessary for TombSync to integrate the ability to output the static files in Metalsmith? And Neil Hastings touched on this, but if you could expand on the answer.
Yeah, I think that it really came down to having to change the shape of the output that was coming out to match GraphQL. So that led to an export, being able to hook into the way that exporting was being done. So Neil has linked over to the actual module that exists that was created to support this project.
Yeah, that's called for the recording. It's called Tome. Tome has a submodule called Tome Sync that exports the static JSON content. That doesn't necessarily integrate it into Metalsmith. That just makes 20,000, thousands of JSON files available for all the entities, and has all the fields and stuff in JSON format. So then the front end build process team is currently working on and writing a transformer of sorts to transform that content into what it used to expect. And we may be exploring, this may be an interim step. We may be exploring more of a progressively decoupled approach, or we're still what is the ideal way. We actually didn't have much say in kind of that for this contract, so which is fine. Like, ship something soon, not 2 years, right? So we may be exploring like a longer term approach for that, but right now this is definitely going to speed things up and deliver a lot of value soon.
Yeah. I think one last question that I see is, Benji, if we were going to start a new decoupled project, would you put the CMS in the front end in the same Git repo? I think I would likely lean that direction, only because then we would never have the problem of the deploys being done differently or at different times, and also would never need sort of feature flags, hopefully. It would be nice if we could have the ability to have an atomic commit that is all this stuff has gone live at the same time. That's sort of my thought process. But again, this is not your traditional decoupled Drupal solution, right? It's a double whammy. It's absolutely positively Drupal being decoupled because it's being used as an API, but it is also integrated into a static site build process. So this is a unique and beautiful animal that happens to be a little brittle and fragile at times, but it actually deploys frequently and provides a lot of value to veterans, and was able to sort of take the existing work that was done for the last 4 years and move it forward and bring Drupal in as a way to improve the editorial workflow. So I don't know that everybody would go this way, but I think in the end, if you had to, I would definitely say all of it should be in the same repository. It would make your life a lot easier.
Great. I think that's all the questions. There were a lot answered in the text, in the chat. If you're watching this recording, you could check the thread on Slack where some participants were very nice enough to copy and paste the questions and answers. Thanks for that. And thanks for Robbie and Elijah presenting on this. Appreciate it. Great presentation, really interesting. And have a great day today, everybody. I'm gonna stop the recording now. Thanks again.
I'll be sticking around in the chat all day, so if you have any questions, feel free to ping me. Have a great day, folks.